Howdy.
Hey, everybody. Hey, Brian. Welcome to Dream Idiots with a quick message about our upcoming episodes for the next 3 weeks, the last 3 weeks of April.
Yes, indeed. Life is interfering a little bit, and so we're going to take a little short hiatus here for a short period of time. We'll be back with fresh and clean and shiny new episodes on May 2nd.
Brian is going to be busy putting together episodes that have to do with our favorite stories from the world of sports, from the world of science, and our first ever curse word compendium, which will consist of all of the best curse words from our curse word of the week segment. And as we said, as Brian said, life gets in the way, or in my case, death. I will be attending my mother's funeral and taking care of all the things that go along with funeral activities and after someone has passed away. And I do want to thank everyone. We've had a few Bay Area, Brad, and a couple other folks have expressed their condolences to me with the loss of my mom, and I really do appreciate it hearing from you guys. Thank you for that.
And thanks for all the stuff you're doing for us. Please keep listening. Got some cool stuff on the horizon here soon. So like and share and subscribe. Shoot us 5 stars if you haven't already. And we're going to be back again in May.
That's right. And this is a good chance if you've got a friend who wants to get into podcasts, or specifically if they're the one or two people who haven't listened to podcasts yet, get them on board with us. This is a good way to do it because it's kind of an intro to us with a little bit of everything. So you might want to toss them this little spring gift of these 3 episodes. Toss it their way if you don't mind. So until then, stay dreamy, stay idiotic, and as always, be good to each other. Thanks. And you, and you, and you, and you were there. Some of it wasn't very nice, but most of it was beautiful.
And we're back.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Brian.
Dr. Mo, how are you?
I am well. It's a beautiful, balmy day here in Colorado. The ice is melting. My heart is melting. It's beautiful out here. It's just wonderful. So,
Balmy as in above freezing?
yes, well above.
Wow.
It's going to get to 70 today, so it's going to be
Oh,
gorgeous.
geez. Wow. Here too. That's weird.
Yeah. Welcome to Dream Idiots. It's also apparently a weather forecast and weather description. Not even a forecast. It's a weather description show now. Each week, Brian and I tell each other stories from history, from the headlines, from our own personal misadventures in our youth. And thanks for joining us. And I think I'm going first. Is that right?
You're up first.
Okay. I want to talk about a fella, but I'm more going to talk about his research. You ever heard of a guy by the name of Arthur Hadley Cantril, Brian?
I have never heard that name.
Okay, I bet you have. You just don't remember. I'll give you his bio, a brief bio, and then I want to talk about his big research project.
Is it actually RuPaul or no?
It is not, no. But he was
Stab in the dark.
He was born in Hiram, Utah, June 16th, 1906.
Mm-hmm.
He died May 28th, 19. He went back in time, and he died May 28th, 1969. Check out these bona fides. Had an undergraduate degree from Dartmouth. Went over to Munich and Berlin and did some studies. Returned and got a PhD in psychology from Harvard. And then he was appointed to, I believe, your granddad's alma mater, Princeton.
Oh,
correct?
Correct.
He studied a lot of very different areas in human psychology, public opinion, persuasion. He lived at the same time, although he didn't live as long, as Walter Lippmann. He was born a few years before he was. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is some research he did from 1938 to 1940. And it has to do with the night that panicked America. Do you remember what that is?
The first thing that came to mind was the Orson Welles War of the Worlds thing. No, that was
exactly,
earlier.
That's exactly what it is.
Oh, okay.
And most people probably know this story, but just to go over it real quick, on October 30th, 1938, Orson Welles and his buddies at Mercury Theater of the Air put on a radio dramatization of H.G. Wells, no relation to Orson, of his book, War of the Worlds. And it's been referred to as the night that panned America because a lot of people thought that the broadcast was real.
Right. And they lost their minds. Right.
Yeah. Now, what I'm going to talk to you today in this episode is kind of about the research that came out of that. Let's just get a few numbers down, and then I'll talk to you about what he felt was most important in the study. And then maybe a brief just talk about some of the problems with it, which I think are, still a pretty good study. He determined listening figures of this program by poll, by telephone volume at radio stations, by mail volume that was received from the 92 radio stations that broadcast this. And overall, he wanted to look at the area of suggestibility. That was the psychological area he wanted to look at. It's estimated, according to Cantril's study, that there were 6 million people listening, and of those 16 million, 28%, some 1.7 million people panicked. Okay, so a little under a third of the people who heard it reacted to this and thought Martians were actually invading. So he wanted to look at 4 factors of suggestibility. And again, this isn't a detailed look at his research, just kind of the broad strokes of what he found. So I want to talk about the 4 factors of suggestibility for this. Number 1, people who were involved that had a mindset that allowed someone to think it was true without checking against external factors. So you might have already had a predisposition or a certain way of looking at the world that caused you to not check against external factors. What does that mean? Well, if you're listening to the radio program, oh my God, Martians are invading, the first thing you could do is turn the dial to another station and see what they're saying.
Right.
Or if you lived in the area of Grover's Mill, New Jersey, where this is happening, you can throw
look outside.
outside. Yeah, you see a green glowing or a fire on the horizon, then it's probably not true. What were some of these mindsets? Well, first of all, people were still living with this idea of the fear of war, the rumblings in Europe that would come to fruition a year later, right, when Hitler invaded Poland. So there was rumors of war. That was one problem. Lack of education. That if you'd not had a formal type schooling where you could develop critical thinking skills, you might not be able to differentiate what was going on and think to check against external sources. Third factor, religion. What do you think the relationship is there between religion and whether or not you panicked and made sure it wasn't true?
In 2022, in my mind, religious folks are the folks that are also the most gullible, and so religious folks probably believed it, are more likely to believe it than atheists.
That is by and large true.
Right.
Particularly if they were a member of a religion that was absolutely focused in eschatology. What is eschatology?
I have no idea.
It's the study of the end of the world in biblical terms. How is the world going to end? So if you're very much concerned with that book of Revelations, right, you might be more susceptible to believing that this was real and not checking. And then he has a 4th category within these mindsets, like if you're a fatalist, if you're overly invested in reading about science, you might have a predilection to believe, oh, this is possible. This is actually possible because I read about it in Popular Science or Weird Fantasy Magazine or any of these other things. So religion, fear of war, lack of education, and then miscellaneous personality traits such as fatalism and so forth. A second factor for suggestibility was rationalization of environmental factors. These folks could not distinguish between reliable and unreliable sources of information. So they might be listening to the show and think, okay, this was an hour-long program. Man, they have gone from landing to conquering most of New Jersey in about 35 minutes. How are they able to do that? Well, maybe the reporters aren't getting the facts right on the ground. Maybe the reporters are scared. They're rationalizing away the inconsistencies as to whether or not this is reality. Another aspect for environmental factors might be, and I think this is true today, that most people, if you hear about it from a panicked person, you are yourself more likely to panic, right? There's a world of difference between a guy calling up and saying, have you heard this shit's going on the radio, versus someone pounding on your door saying, the Martians are coming, the Martians are coming. There's also a legend that has been pretty much refuted at this point that a lot of people turned in late because there was an unpopular guest on the Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy show. So they didn't hear the disclaimers in the beginning. But as some of the critics point out, that probably wasn't the case. That was probably been overblown throughout the years. Okay, but that's the second part, rationalization or environmental factors that lead to the suggestibility that allow you to, or make it impossible for you to distinguish between reliable and unreliable sources of information. Suggestibility number 3. No standard of judgment can be applied or reached for these individuals. They're unable to get to that point where they can say, wait a minute, is this right? They trust the radio, the prestige of the radio. So they do have a standard of judgment. They just can't get to it because they're so enraptured by trusting the narration. And to its credit, if you've never listened to it, and I suspect you have, but if you're listening to it and you've never actually listened to the 1938 broadcast, it's available out there on the internet. It's fantastic. I mean, it's a great radio show. It sounds good. It's got Orson Welles' beautiful narration. It sounds great, especially for something that is, made in 1938. It sounds amazing. Okay. Suggestibility factor number 4 is pretty much an extreme version of number 3. And these are folks who have no awareness that they have no standard of judgment. It's kind of like the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. Right? They have absolutely no awareness that they have no standard of judgment whatsoever and just absolutely accept what they hear. They don't even realize that other interpretations could be possible. Okay, so that's what he looked at when he said these folks were suggestible to believing that this was a real event. Okay, so I could see myself falling into some of these traps. This was taken from his study called The Invasion from Mars, a study in the psychology of panic. It was originally published in 1940. He was able to put this together in a year and change, basically, to get this published. Now, some folks have, specifically, there's a piece on Slate called Myth of War of the Worlds by Sokolow and Cooley from 2013. And they point out there's a lot of problems with the study. He overshot estimations of the number of people listening. He had problems with the way that he defined the word panicked. They're not quite sure that the way that he appraised how many people listening was appropriate. And, I think those are all probably pretty valid. And I didn't read all the way through their criticism, so I don't know what their take on this was, or at least I didn't catch it because I skimmed it. But I thought it was a pretty good critique of what went wrong. But at the same time, I'd like to point out the fact that he was able to put this study together in the time frame he did with the resources that he had in 1938, that's still pretty amazing. And I don't think it takes away from some of these ideas that he's looking at least as a starting point for how people accept messages like this. Because when I used to teach this in a mass media course, this is 20 years ago, I'd ask the students, what would have to happen today for a fake story like this to be thought of as true? Mm. Oh, well, you'd have to get all these different people involved. You'd have to get trusted authorities or people that you trust as authorities to tell you falsehoods. And we all kind of agreed back then, this probably wouldn't happen today, in the modern world. And I would like to state for the record that I clearly was wrong.
Right.
Given some of the things that have been going on in our world, given the fact that we have this almost, no standards of not even objective reality, but intersubjective reality, where we can at least agree on sometimes what is real or what is not. And right. I think what it comes down to kind of pull it all together here is I mentioned Walter Lippmann early, who was an American journalist, columnist. He was a philosopher. Walter Lippmann was really one of the guys that kind of we point to in communication studies as being one of the great theorists that kind of started us all off. And his famous quote is, people believe, quote, the pictures in their heads over critical thinking. And he wrote that back, I think, in 22 or 23, almost 100 years ago. And damn, he nailed it, right? I mean, critical thinking is just out the door. So, I don't know what it says about today's environment we live in, but man, I'm seeing a lot of those inability to distinguish between good information, bad information, trusting the story and the teller over the actual facts. And then finally, that last one, no awareness that they actually do not have a standard of judgment, right? I mean, just we see that when someone passes along a Facebook post or any of these things. So anyway, so that's Hadley Cantril. Despite its faults, I still think it's certainly one of the great pieces in communication and theory that moved away from this idea that what we call the magic bullet theory of communication, or the hypodermic needle, where we're filled with a message and we all get it the same way and we all understand it. No, everybody brings with them some kind of baggage
right,
in trying to understand a message. And anyway, that's my bit for the day. Arthur Hadley Cantril's important work, The Invasion from Mars, a study in the psychology of panic.
All right, we're going to shift gears here a little bit and dive into a story that I found this story on a few different sources, and I don't recall now where I read it first. You can find different versions of this story on 8 or 10 different websites. I'm not frankly certain which version of the story is the most accurate, because it feels like portions of this must have been exaggerated or overblown or something for effect. So anyway, when you hear this story, you can do some Googling yourself and figure out how true or false you think this story might be. So there is a YouTuber, and this kid he's on YouTube, he's on Twitter. His name's Lucas Risotto. A young guy, early mid-20s, I think. And he found himself in this sort of peculiar situation. Now, a few weeks ago, I'd asked you if you had an imaginary friend when you were a kid, and you said you did. There's a little boy who looked just like you. Was your imaginary friend?
But he was a real jerk.
Okay. So Lucas's imaginary friend was the family microwave oven. That just seems crazy by itself, but whatever. So the family's microwave, this is early 2000s. Lucas named the microwave Magnetron, spoke to the microwave every single day. His parents were apparently a little bit puzzled by this behavior. He was roundly mocked by his one older sister that just gave him hell for it, and talked to the microwave every day, and really started to give the microwave something of a backstory. So there was a narrative. So the microwave was named Magnetron. Magnetron was born in, for some reason, 1895. Magnetron fought in World War I somehow, lost all of his family. I don't know whether his family were other microwaves or whether he was supposed to be, I don't know, but there's some this kid's version of a story for this microwave. Magnetron fought in World War I, saw all kinds of combat, saw all the horrors of war, and lost all of his family in World War I. And so that's sort of the narrative of what this imaginary friend's story is. So flash forward a little bit, there is now this trend toward open source software across a myriad of basically software platforms. One of them, OpenAI, is an Elon Musk creation for one of his companies. I forget what the name of his AI company is, because he has 47 different companies. But open source AI is this text-based, English language-based platform under which you can train devices and basically give hardware systems, I guess, something of a memory, something of a conscience, sort of, the ability to be cognitive, the ability to learn, the ability to teach themselves. And so this is the science fiction horror story you've heard 1,000 times from tons of different movies, where the computer learned something and then came back to haunt them, right? So this guy, for some reason, decides he wants to bring Magnetron to life. And so goes out and buys a new microwave that has updated wiring and attaches a microphone to it and sets about building out basically the database of knowledge for Magnetron and types up a 100-page backstory for Magnetron. So, that this whole story of the narrative of having been born in the late 19th century and having fought, and gives this microwave the entire sort of narrative of who he was, who he was, right? And so I lost my place in my notes here. And so it actually, does wind up working to the point where this kid, or this, Risotto, can talk to the microwave and give it verbal commands to microwave something, but can also talk to it like it was a sentient human being, because it has this sort of limited AI. At one point, Magnetron says to Risotto, "I have seen men holding their guts with their own hands, crying out for their mothers." And another one of Magnetron's comments was, "For years, this was my life, always surrounded by death, but never claimed by it." Is this Apocalypse Now? What is this? This is just so dangerous and it's just stupid. And Risotto begins to realize, okay, I've designed a microwave oven that has PTSD. Like, what the hell is going on? At one point, Risotto asks Magnetron what's on his mind, and all that he responds is revenge, revenge, revenge. He says revenge over and over again. Another time, Risotto asks him if he can recite a poem, and spontaneously, the microwave says, "Roses are red, violets are blue. You're a backstabbing bitch, and I will kill you." Like, okay. Anyway, I mean, up until now, Magnetron had been able to sort of respond organically using the database of information that he had, but there was these random and occasional bursts of violence, or at least threats of violence.
Magnetron, I don't think this is about poetry anymore. If you're telling me that it's not about the poem,
right. So at one point, I mean, Risotto's getting, I guess, more and more alarmed, and then at one point, Risotto, I'm sorry, Magnetron says to Risotto, requests that he enter the microwave. So there's no camera on, on it. So he doesn't, I guess, whatever this limited consciousness is, doesn't have a sense. I don't know. I don't understand the AI side of this one bit, but tells Risotto to enter the microwave, and Risotto's like, okay, like opens the door, then closes the door, and tells Magnetron, okay, I'm inside, and Magnetron says microwave 30 seconds, turns himself on basically, and starts running. And whereupon, so Risotto stops him, and then asks, "Why did you just try to kill me?" And Magnetron responds, "Because I wanted to hurt you the same way you hurt me. You left out of the blue and didn't talk to me for 15 fucking years." So what happened is he created this 100-page narrative from 1895 to some point in like 2005, 2007. But at that point, the narrative just ends, right? Because so there's just a blank from 2007 until present. And so somehow Magnetron, is already suffering from PTSD from World War I, gathers together enough inferences based on what that would feel like. I guess. This is so friggin' crazy. But sees this 15-year gap and projects this reaction. I suppose. I guess. And so it's pretty much at this point that Risotto says, "You know what? I mean, I judge he tried for a second to convince Magnetron that the had not in fact been abandoned, but then he realized I'm arguing with a microwave. This is freaking crazy. And it was, he realized he had just gone too far and decided Magnetron was obviously the villain and just shut him down. Just like, yeah, I give up. Just turn him off.
Murderer.
So be careful what you wish for. Do not make your microwave smart.
Jacques risotto. Murderer.
Revenge. Revenge.
And of course, you realize that with my first story about the organic nature of the human body and your story about metallic computer interfaces, I think we've just written an Emerson, Lake and Palmer album.
Right. Yes, but the one other quote I didn't mention, but Magnetron said as well, you grew up and forgot I existed. For 15 years I had no one. I was alone. For 15 years I was in hell. Wow. So okay, good times.
Wow. This Magnetron should get together with the HAL 9000 and have a conversation. That's good stuff, Brian. That is I'm not sure I would have gone with Magnetron though. I think maybe Beepy Beeperton. That would have been a good name, right?
Okay.
Something a little bit friendlier. So what kind of voice would it use? Would it just a computer generated voice like
I suppose so.
Like Malice or okay.
Like the curse word, I suppose. It's just a computer generated. You're a backstabbing bitch, and I will kill you.
Okay. But I would like to talk to you today about a fellow by the name of Herman Kahn. You ever heard the name?
Name rings a bell, but not placing it.
Okay. He is the love child of Herman Munster and Ricardo Montalban.
And Madeline Kahn.
Yeah, and Madeline Kahn. No, Herman Kahn, spelled K-A-H-N, just like Madeline Kahn, I believe. He was born in 1922, passed away in 1983. And I think that Herman Kahn might be perhaps the single most influential public intellectual in regards to shaping nuclear policy for the United States. He referred to himself, at the time he is well known, but now people don't talk about him much. He referred to himself once as one of the 10 most famous obscure Americans, which kind of gets to the point of his humor. He held a position with the Rand Institute, or the Rand Corporation rather, from 1948 to 1961. And of course, we know the Rand Corporation to be a public policy think tank, where this idea that certain dollars go into this think tank where people sit and think about big ideas, like, for example, nuclear war. He left the Rand Corporation in 1961 and formed his own institute called the Hudson Institute back east. Rand Corporation was California. He went back east to where he was from and formed the Hudson Institute, which is now known as a conservative think tank. They count among their luminaries today Scooter Libby, just to give you a sense of where they are today. But in 1961, on the last day of a congressional session, Kahn's personal testimony, he was called up by one of the senators, and he helped pass a bill that established the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, the ACDA.
Okay.
The Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. Another futurist, and probably subject of your future episode for this show, Freeman Dyson, said that Kahn argued for the ACDA in language conservative senators could understand. And that's not a slam against, say, the right wing, but it's this idea that you could be a conservative Democrat or a liberal Republican, right? Something that has virtually vanished today.
Right.
But for those who are more conservative thinkers, more hardliners with the war, he wanted to create this idea that a nuclear war was survivable. Okay? And he wrote a book in 1960, wrote a series of lectures that he put together in a book that came out in 61 that was titled On Thermonuclear War. And it was an influential piece of public intellectual property. People were talking about it, not just politicians, but other public intellectuals. People might have a copy of it at home going over what it meant. It was a series of lectures with titles such as Will the Survivors Envy the Dead? And basically another title which kind of confirmed his way of looking at things, something called Neither Oblivion Nor Surrender. He had a series of figures, tables, illustrations, stories, all written in a very free-flowing style. Evan Jones, who wrote the introduction to 2007 edition of On Thermonuclear War, called the book iconoclastic, interdisciplinary, calm, and reasonable. He brought rationality to the public nuclear debate. As a result, both sides were better able to avoid disaster during the Cold War. Both sides, of course, being the United States and the Soviet Union.
Right.
The strategic concepts still apply. Strategic defense, local animosities, and the usual balance of power issues are still with us today. Critics at the time argued that the book was basically a how-to manual on how to conduct nuclear war. But his idea of counterforce plus what he called avoidance, avoiding nuclear situations, became policy for basically 3 decades. This guy's ideas influenced 6 presidential administrations. I mean, from Kennedy through Reagan. The Peace Catalog from 1984 argued that On Thermonuclear War is still the best introduction to the if we do this, they'll do that school of strategic analysis.
Right.
Which is basically game theory, which I'll get to in a minute. But Evan Jones concludes his little introduction by saying the Cold War is over despite crises ranging from Berlin to Cuba. The West won a decisive victory without the use of a singular nuclear weapon on either side. But the nuclear genie is out of the bottle, and the lessons and principles developed on thermonuclear war apply as much to today's China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea as much as they did to the Soviets. This book was filled with interdisciplinary information, and it was exhaustive in its breadth and depth. Various sections on the specific effects of radioactive material, for example, genetic consequences, insurance rates of certain parts of the United States, possible targets, scenarios. I remember being told once by, I want to say it was one of my 3rd grade teachers living in San Antonio, we wouldn't have to worry about surviving the nuclear war because San Antonio would be wiped off the map
right,
because we had 4 Air Force bases, a Marine camp, and a
the Army base,
Fort Sam Houston, the one of the medical hubs of the U.S. Army branch. But overall, Kahn used game theory in speculating that a nuclear war was not only winnable but survival. And game theory consists basically of mathematical models based on rational agents. That is, optimizing results, 2 parties working to a specific end, given known facts and information, the logical decision-making process. So they would have a big table where one side would play the United States, one side would play the Soviet Union. Let's do a first strike here and see what happens. How would you guys respond? We'd respond with this. And they would work through the different scenarios. So he used, in these essays, which I'm not going to read anything from them, and here's a picture of him, by the way, just so you can get a visual sense of the man. You want to describe him for the folks?
Oh, rotund, looks a bit like Churchill.
he's pretty pear-shaped. He's Mr. 5x5. He's a large dude. But he used he had this appearance. I mean, you watch videos of him, he's unassuming yet confident. He really is fun to watch talk, but he used dark humor to make his points. There's a great book I read for this many years ago called The Worlds of Herman Kahn by Sharon, I apologize, Gamari Tabrizi, wrote a book called The Worlds of Herman Kahn. And she makes a real great argument that this sick humor and the dark humor of that was just coming to the forefront in the 1960s was one of the reasons that Kahn was so appealing a public intellectual. Sick humor as devised by someone, say, Lenny Bruce. Okay. But at the same time, there was also this development, and this is something that last podcast on the left with Ben and Henry and Marcus Parks talk about when they cover Ed Gein, the butcher of Plainfield, the man who was the basis for Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Psycho. And Psycho. And this guy who basically made furniture and implements for his house out of people's skin. And Dan Cummins from Time Suck did a great episode on him too. This dark humor that prevailed, for example, when Ed Gein was doing his business in the 50s in Wisconsin, one of the sick humor jokes that Dan Cummins recited was something like, why doesn't Ed Gein's house have air conditioning so his furniture doesn't get goose pimples? Right? Just this idea of sick, dark humor that we can't quite accept as appropriate, but it gets a point across. And of course, one of my favorite jokes is, and I've told this to you many times, the joke about the serial killer and his victim walking through the woods. And the victim says, these woods are scary. And the serial killer says, why don't you think of me for a change? I'm going to have to walk back through these woods alone. Right. Or even Gilbert Gottfried's 9/11 joke that he made in the famous roast scene that I'm sure you've seen online, where he attended a roast right after 9/11. And his opening joke was, sorry, I'm late. My plane had an unexpected stop at the Empire State Building. And the entire crowd booed him. And then he launches into his version of the Aristocrats. This scene is featured in the Aristocrats documentary, the late Gilbert Gottfried. Mm-hmm. But sick humor was seen in Lenny Bruce, Mad Magazine, public currency at the time. And I had a teacher in middle school, which would have been during the Cold War, who said that kind of humor, and strangely enough, you and I were talking about the Challenger explosion before we started recording. He asked us one in history class, because we were talking about the importance of that date and if we would remember it, which we all would, of course. He said, are you hearing any sick jokes about it? And people were uncomfortable. Oh, yeah, I'm hearing this one. And because sick jokes are a sign of healing, that you're learning to deal with a tragedy you've just witnessed.
Right.
And what greater tragedy than annihilation by nuclear fire, right? And that's what Herman Kahn was dealing with. He was, in fact, at the time, considering making a serious film about nuclear war. He wanted to make a really in-depth movie about the effects of nuclear war. He had lunch with a young film director, and the topic was mainly of what we just discussed, this idea of sick humor and how does it play into nuclear war. And another term that Garmari Tabrizi uses is the comedy of the unspeakable. How do we discuss something as horrific as the end of civilization without having dark humor in there somewhere? Similar to the way that doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals have to develop a thick skin through dark humor. That young film director went on to make a movie, and that movie was Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. That was Stanley Kubrick. And Dr. Strangelove himself, not the physical characteristics, but Dr. Strangelove was based in part on Herman Kahn and his other Rand associates. There's a character in Failsafe who was based, Sidney Lumet's movie is based on Herman Kahn, appears in Failsafe apparently. And to tie it back to one of the things we were talking about earlier, War Games, the film War Games that came out in 83, I think, about a young man who hacks into the NORAD Defense Center and accidentally almost starts a nuclear war. Matthew Broderick, Ali Sheedy, and a host of great 80s actors like Dabney Coleman and Barry Corbin, and even Michael Madsen and John Spencer are in that film, believe it or not. Now, the character of Falcon is reportedly based on Stephen Hawking. But the character of Falcon is the guy that programs this computer to realize that nuclear war is an unwinnable game.
Right.
And War Games serves as kind of a response to, I think, this wave of thinking that it is survival, because it is not winnable or survival the way they play it out in the film. And then there's an album by Roger Waters, Mines Similar Territory, an album called Radio Chaos, which has similar themes to it. So we grew up in all that milieu, this fighting between mutually assured destruction and this idea of the winnable nuclear war through preparation, through privatized shelters, which actually, according to McCaney in a book I read a long time back, this idea of the private bomb shelter was a fantasy. Not as many people were building bomb shelters historically we've thought. Mm-hmm. More people are relying on civil defense shelters. And it is interesting in a period of time where the country was pushing people to be individuals and take responsibility for what happened in nuclear war, build your bomb shelters. More people still went to civil defense shelters for what they would perceive as a way to survive a nuclear war. A couple of final thoughts on this. Kahn died right after the Reagan administration announced the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, known as the Star Wars Defense.
Right.
He loved it. He thought it was a great idea because it was inventive. It thought outside conventional means. He loved this idea of the SDI, being able to shoot missiles down before they even get to their targets. And recently, just July 12th, I believe, have you heard about the New York City's new PSA for surviving a nuclear attack? Just aired.
They aired it and everyone freaked out.
And it's ridiculous. But this PSA is doing what? it is adhering to Kahn's perception of this nuclear war being survivable. What to do in the case of a nuclear attack in New York City? Really?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Go inside, take your clothes off because they've been contaminated, put them in a bag, throw them away. It's very calm. It's very logical. It's very rational. And it also seems, from my perspective, kind of silly. I mean, you're in the most populated city in the United States.
Right.
But there it is, right? There's this PSA that is reaffirming this guy's perspective that was 61 years ago, right? I mean, that's been this dominant policy. And here it pops up once again in a PSA from July 12th. So in that respect, I think Herman Kahn, originally my thesis that I posted, when he's probably the most influential thinker in terms of nuclear policy, I could be right. His ideas are still here. They're still very much prevalent. And as Evan Jones points out in that introduction, we're still dealing with different countries who have these policies.
Right, absolutely.
Okay, well, I just think that Kahn's legacy is still with us, as evidenced by the PSA and the way we are talking about current nuclear threats due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah.
Sources for this piece: Herman Kahn's On Thermonuclear War from 1960, Evan Jones from the introduction to the 2007 edition of that book, Freeman Dyson's Disturbing the Universe from 79, Sharon Gamari Tabrizi's The Worlds of Herman Kahn from 2005, Wikipedia, Mental Floss, 15 Surprising Facts About War Games by a guy named Matthew Jackson, Nuclear Preparedness PSA from New York City's Emergency Management, and that was on cbsnews.com from July 12th, and 3 YouTube videos: Herman Kahn's Towards Tomorrow, Utopia BBC documentary, The Centenary of Herman Kahn from the Hudson Institute, and then another video called Mutually Assured Destruction with Herman Kahn from something called The Power Principle. And then notes and ideas from my own dissertation from several years ago. So that's Herman Kahn in a nutshell. This guy who said there's not one future, there's multiple futures. And depending on what strategic point paths we take, we will get to certain futures in a certain way, given nuclear war.
Right.
That's the kind of stuff. This is the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night, just thinking about guys like Herman Kahn. And ultimately, I don't know how to feel about him. I mean, I think he's an entertaining read. He's clearly super intelligent, but it's could he also be full of shit? Yeah, probably. I mean, I can't wrap my mind around. I keep coming back to the title of his one essay, Will the Survivors Envy the Dead? And my answer is yes. I think in a nuclear situation, they would.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my first thought was, if the alarms go off right now and, there are missiles coming in, I don't want to live. I'm not, how long after a Holocaust will podcasters be needed? 1,000 years. I mean, so that's I'm sort of fine with that. I wonder what Kahn would think of SDI now. I mean, because I think you said he died in 83.
83, yeah.
Okay. So I mean, it turns out that SDI was a complete mirage. SDI didn't actually exist. They wanted it to exist, and they manufactured it and oversold it in order to make Gorbachev come to the table and negotiate, start treaties, and the whole we have to build up in order to build down bullshit that Reagan put forth. Yep. It's interesting that this is your topic. I was strangely considering talking about something that's a little bit adjacent, because I stumbled across a TED talk from Malcolm Gladwell talking about the Norton aiming device. There's a device that was manufactured in the 30s by an American scientist who was a devout Christian, and the aiming on this bombing on this device was placed on bombs, and he really liked it because it allegedly would allow bombers to have a higher level of precision, and so therefore innocent people wouldn't be killed. And American forces, told those on those planes that you had to defend this device, this device itself, not the plane, just the device, not the bombs, just the device. You had to, had to defend this because this device can't fall into the hands of the Germans. Well, Norton had already given it to the Germans beforehand, so Germany had the exact same aiming device, and it turns out it was not very precise. It only hit only hit targets 10% of the time. There's some famous bombing raid they went on where they were attacking some big manufacturing facility, and they basically missed it because this device was not very accurate. And the same aiming device was used on the Enola Gay over Hiroshima, and it missed its target by like 1,000 feet. But when you're dropping a bomb that's that big, it doesn't really matter. But no one told Norton while he was alive that it was used, because he would be devastated, because of course 125,000 people died in Hiroshima, I think.
I don't know the numbers off the top of my head.
Right. So indiscriminate killing, but
yeah. And do we reach a point? I think the answer is obviously yes, but where our technology outpaces our moral understanding? Clearly that happens all the time in history. Right. And do we really need this, kind of device comes up when we read stories like this? And I don't know. You said that what would Herman Kahn think of the Norton? Was that your question?
Think of I mean, he was alive during that, but so if he was an advocate for, or like the fact that SDI was being postulated or being worked on, did he find out during his lifetime that it turns out it was all a mirage? It didn't. I mean, I don't think he did, because he died in 1983, and it was like right after they announced, I think. Right. So that idea in theory was great, but it turns out it was horseshit. Right. I think he would love the idea of a space force. Seriously, I think he would. I think he would love the idea of a space force. And you and I, we're going to enlist, right? I want to join the Space Force. You go first. Okay. Be weightless. So farting in space. Clat farting in space. Did you see what the commander was wearing? What kind of zero G suit is that? So as I said, I might look at some other futurists, specifically Freeman Dyson, who I mentioned in this piece, and I also might look at a guy by the name of Buckminster Fuller, just to get a sense of what futurism can really hold. And I think, like the worlds of Herman Kahn, there are many views of the future, and Herman Kahn's was just one of them, but it was certainly a predominant one, and one that still affects us today. So there he is, Herman Kahn. Nice. This week on Dream Idiots, we're not actually that idiotic. That was this was actually, dare I say, almost cerebral. No. Yes, but we saved ourselves from that fate by having clat fart in there. So yeah, you only come off as smart and articulate 1 in 10 episodes, and that's about the right Brian there, but for the grace of clat fart go I. All right, we're done for another one, folks. Thanks for listening. Please rate and subscribe and share and do all those good things for us, and let us know what you think. Thank you, everybody. Have a good week.